I'm almost positive you already know where we're starting tonight's show with that huge verdict for Kyle Rittenhouse. Not guilty after a jury acquitted him of homicide during those racial justice protests last year. A trial that raised new questions over race, guns, vigilantism, protests, and a verdict that is keeping those questions front and center. We're going to take you to Kenosha, plus only on this show, reaction live from a lawyer for one of the victims' families. We've also got breaking news from the CDC tonight. Now one step closer to making booster shots available to all adults. Our doctor explains if you don't have an appointment yet, you should make one if you want the best possible protection this winter. And you might want that best possible protection before what doctors predict will be this post-Thanksgiving surge, with the holiday set to be the busiest one yet since the pandemic started, and set to be kind of a nightmare with two storms that Al Roker is going to track for us in a minute. Plus, we talk so much about, inflation this, inflation that, but what does that mean in actual dollars for actual people? The retired teacher I just talked with for tonight's original is going to make that very clear. And thousands of Americans are killed by drunk drivers every year. Some car makers want those drivers off the road. And the new infrastructure law, it's going to give them the money to do just that. Hey, I'm Hallie, and we're coming on the air with that breaking news out of Kenosha, where Kyle Rittenhouse is a free man tonight, found not guilty of homicide after killing two people during racial justice protests last year. It's a case and a trial that has divided us, depending on where we are in the political spectrum, as we all watched it play out in a Wisconsin courtroom over the past couple weeks. Rittenhouse, who's 18 and was facing life in prison, broke down as the verdict was read. Watch.
Out of the information, Joseph Rosenbaum, we, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty. As to the second count of the information, Richard McGinnis, we, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty. As to the third count of the information, unknown male, we, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty. As to the fourth count of the information, Anthony Huber, we, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty. As to the fifth count of the information, Gage Grosskreutz, we, the jury, find the defendant, Kyle H. Rittenhouse, not guilty.
You can see Rittenhouse start to, it appears, fall to the ground there. We're going to talk with the lawyer who represents one of Rittenhouse's victims in just a second. But we want to start on the ground with Shaquille Brewster, who is in Kenosha. Shaq, thanks for being with us tonight. Tell me what it's been like in the hours since we've gotten that verdict.
Well, Hallie, I'll tell you, it's very calm outside of the courthouse, and you might hear a buzz of helicopters overhead, but there have not been large-scale demonstrations. We saw a lot of people on the courthouse steps right after the verdict was being read and kind of lingering throughout, sometimes marching in this downtown area. But since then, it has been very muted. You have the largest presence here is the media presence. We know that the National Guard has been on standby, but they have not been needed. We haven't seen a significant law enforcement presence here. I'll tell you, many people have told me they've been waiting for the moment that this verdict came so that they can hopefully return to normal. And as of now, things are still calm here in Kenosha.
Let's talk about what we've heard from the folks on both sides of this trial. The prosecution has come out to say they're disappointed with the verdict, but they respect it. And then we heard from the defense attorney for Kyle Rittenhouse about this kind of controversial decision to put Rittenhouse on the stand that, in hindsight, given the acquittal here, seemed to work in their favor. Here's Mark Richards.
Had to put him on. It wasn't a close call. At certain points, we wondered whether we would put him on. We did. We had a mock jury, and we did two different juries, one with him testifying, one without him testifying. It was substantially better when he testified, I mean, to a marked degree.
And Shaq, that testimony, as you well know from being out there, from reporting on this, was really dramatic. Rittenhouse obviously started crying on the stand. It is always risky to put a defendant up on the stand when you're doing one of these trials. But in this instance, it seems like that bet has paid off.
Yeah, it was risky, it was unusual, it was something that legal experts told us, frankly, not to expect because of the level of risk involved. And it was really interesting to hear that from the defense attorney, really take us behind the scenes into the preparations behind this. The fact that they had a mock jury, he said it was a no-brainer to have Kyle Rittenhouse take the stand. And it was also the moment, if you get outside of the people who've been covering this trial since the beginning, it was really the moment where you saw this trial start to take on the coverage nationally, where his entire entire testimony largely was carried on all three cable networks. It was something that people started really plugging in and focusing on and following, and it seems to have worked out in the defense's favor at this point.
Let me talk big picture with you, because you know as well as I do, you in Kenosha, me sitting here in Washington, that this became almost like a Second Amendment litmus test, I think, for a lot of people. There was a political backdrop to this. And tonight you have the NRA, the National Rifle Association, tweeting out what some are perceiving as a bit of a victory lap, saying that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. This was a case, Shaq, with a teenager crossing state lines with an AR-15, shooting and killing 2 people. And it's that set of facts that has created so much of this conversation around, the Second Amendment, self-defense versus vigilantism and so on.
Yeah, and it's really been reflected in the statements that we've seen since this verdict. You mentioned the NRA statement that came out, which quoted the Second Amendment. We also heard and saw statements from the governor of this state. We saw the statement from the president of the United States. And you see the divide there. That was reflected right here on the courthouse steps. I'll tell you, when the verdict was read, right after it was read, you had people on the stairs who were supporting Kyle Rittenhouse, who were saying that he was acting in self-defense, that he was exercising his Second Amendment, and you had people who were opposing him and calling for his conviction and calling for justice for the 2 men that he shot. And one person walked out of the courthouse, told the crowd what the result was, and you saw the mixture of frustration and sadness and celebrations. There were cheers for some of the people in the crowd there. So the divide that you have nationally, it definitely also played out in the courtroom. And I think one other point, that's what makes this case unique, that they leaned into that political backdrop that has been there and that we're seeing in the fallout of this trial.
Shaq Brewster, it's been great reporting out there from Kenosha, including all day today and all night tonight. Thank you very much for being with us. I want to turn now to Anand Swaminathan, an attorney for Anthony Huber's family. Huber is one of the men killed by Kyle Rittenhouse. The other was Jason Rosenbaum. Mr. Swaminathan, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you.
Can you tell us what it was like for the Hubers as the verdict was read and how they're feeling right now?
They're devastated. John and Karen, they were hoping that there would be some accountability through this process for the death of their son. And obviously there hasn't been today. So they're extremely sad, they're extremely frustrated, and they're outraged.
What do they plan to do next? And I ask because I wonder if they plan to take any civil action against Rittenhouse. Could civil charges, could a lawsuit be on the way?
Yeah. Well, they have filed a lawsuit already, and they have a lawsuit that is currently pending against the Kenosha City police officers and Kenosha County Sheriff's Department for their role in creating this sort of powder keg situation in Kenosha, where the utterly foreseeable consequence of their decision to sort of allow these armed militias to sort of really take over their streets and really cede control to these guys was exactly the kind of death that we saw of not only Anthony Huber, but Mr. Rosenbaum and Mr. Grosskreutz. So that civil lawsuit was designed to create accountability for the law enforcement agents and their role in this. And the criminal justice system was hopefully going to produce some accountability for Mr. Rittenhouse and his role in this case. And obviously we see today that that didn't happen. So certainly the family is considering all of its options. Okay,
so considering options, no decision yet. Do I hear you correctly on that?
That's right. We have just heard the verdict today. I think everybody is processing it, and certainly we are keeping our options open. We'll make those decisions in the coming days.
As you are processing this, what do you think the prosecution could have done differently here?
I'm really not in a position where I would say I would second guess the decision making of the prosecution and so on. I mean, ultimately, I think what we're really concerned about is the idea that somebody can come into a town armed with an assault rifle or any weapon of war of their choice, or any number of weapons of war of their choice, and create an extremely dangerous and highly volatile situation, and then point to that same dangerous and highly volatile situation and say that justifies me shooting people in the streets in cold blood. To me, that is an extremely scary idea, and I think people of good and decent people, when they see this kind of idea, the potential message that's being sent today, I think it's extremely scary and concerning.
I know the Hubers did not attend the trial. They did not want to be in the courtroom for what was being presented there. But I wonder, there's been a lot of discussion around the judge in this case. We heard Mr. Rittenhouse's defense attorney say that he believed that the judge was fair. Would the Hubers agree with that assessment?
The Hubers are really focused on Mr. Rittenhouse and about accountability for Mr. Rittenhouse. They have been watching this trial intently. As you said, they have not been attending it in person. For them, the idea of sitting in the courtroom and watching their son's death be played over and over on video, that was not something that they were prepared to deal with. And really the kind of comments and negativity and hateful things that were said to them in the early days after the shooting, they were extremely concerned about the idea of attending in person, but they were certainly following very intently, and certainly with the hope that the judicial process here would result in a conviction. And they didn't give up faith in that idea at any point through the judge's pretrial rulings and through the court process. And so today is an extremely difficult day for them to hear this outcome.
Anand Swaminathan, thank you so much for being with us. Again, the attorney for the Huber family. I appreciate your time. I want to bring in Danny Savalos on how this unfolded. Danny, we obviously just heard from the attorney for one of the family members, the people shot by Kyle Rittenhouse. We also talked about the idea of putting Rittenhouse on the stand, and that seemed to have made a difference here. Can you talk about that having an impact on what the jury may have thought? And let's be clear here, we haven't heard from any member of the jury yet, right? As far as I know, nobody's come to a camera and talked. Nobody's put out a statement as far as a member of the jury. So some of this is just informed speculation.
You heard from defense counsel. They felt they had to put him on, and they planned to put him on. But then he kind of equivocated and said, but there were moments where we had doubt, essentially. But it's easy right now for someone like me to say, hey, the gamble paid off because there is an acquittal. Arguably, they had enough to just point to the prosecution and say, look, you've seen the video. They haven't made their case. But it's always a risky proposition. Maybe in a self-defense case, it's slightly less risky because he's expressing the fear that he had at the moment. But always a risky proposition, even with an acquittal after the fact.
How, if at all, might this trial influence other cases or other instances involving shootings where somebody then claims self-defense?
Well, self-defense has always been controversial. So has stand your ground and the Castle Doctrine, which stand your ground is just an extension of Castle Doctrine. It's been controversial for a long time because it's hard for a lot of people to process that somebody with a firearm may be in mortal fear of somebody with no weapon at all. But that is a reality.
Danny Savalos, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Appreciate it. Right as we were coming on the air, we learned a CDC panel just gave the green light for all adults to get a booster shot, either Pfizer or Moderna. That's after they went back and forth all day about the pros and cons of expanding access to boosters on that panel. The bottom line is this here, right? The unanimous vote today basically strips away some of the kind of complicated, kind of confusing rules about who's eligible for the booster and who's not. So now at this point, we're just waiting on the CDC director to give that final go-ahead, which means you could see people getting these federal government-approved shots as soon as this weekend. I want to bring in Dr. Natalie Azar to talk about this. So, Dr. Azar, talk about the importance of people to get booster shots to stave off what we know might be coming down the pike here, which is a post-Thanksgiving surge, right? Another wave of cases in the country.
Absolutely. And I think it's just a good time to reinforce what the goals of vaccination are. The primary goal, of course, is to prevent severe disease. All three vaccines that are authorized or approved in this country still are performing very, very well in that regard. But the secondary goal is to prevent infection, asymptomatic or mild infection, and potentially even, Hallie, to prevent transmission. We don't have U.S. data yet on whether or not boosting will reduce transmission. That is a huge, huge thing of importance, of course, but we borrow and extrapolate from Israeli data, as we always do, and they do have data that boosted individuals have lower viral loads than their non-boosted counterparts. So we can assume that we can probably also reduce transmission with boosting. So you're protecting yourself and you're protecting those around you.
So in plain English, if you're a healthy adult, right, you're over the age of 18, let's say you're not immunocompromised, you're not elderly, you don't have any of those other kinds of pre-existing conditions, if you will, what would you recommend to your patients? Go out and get the booster, go out and get it now, go out and get it in 6 weeks? What do you say?
You know, it's interesting because I have certainly shifted, as I think a lot of public health experts have shifted in the last couple of weeks, to being a little bit looser in terms of my recommendation to boost. And let me be very clear. The CDC wording, you know, we can criticize it sometimes. I want to be thoughtful about my criticism because I know they're doing their best to try to communicate clearly. But, you know, what they've said is that individuals 50 and over should get boosted no matter what their circumstances, and individuals 18 and up may get boosted. So, there's still a little bit of confusion there saying, should I or shouldn't I? And this is what I would say.
It's can versus should, right? So it's like you can get boosted, but should you? I mean, that's kind of, it feels like that's the distinction.
Exactly. May get boosted doesn't really tell you whether or not you should or not. Again, for that group, and we've been talking about, I always use the 25-year-old healthy person, should they get boosted? And the answer is simply this. The balance of risk and benefit is clearly higher if you're older and if you have underlying medical conditions. But Hallie, as cases continue to rise, or the other way to say it is continue to not go down the way we would like to see them go down, then that risk-benefit analysis shifts even for someone who's younger. And for the reasons that I said at the outset, preventing infection is a good thing. You don't want to get long COVID. And frankly, even if you're not hospitalized or get severe disease, COVID-19 can certainly impact your health chronically and give you really significant long-term health sequelae. So, I think our mindset is changing a little bit, Hallie, to thinking, you know what, the more COVID-19 infections we prevent, it might actually be better, not only for the individual, but also for, the public and the population at large.
Dr. Natalie Azar, thank you so much for being with us. Appreciate that guidance. Thanks. So here we are, Friday before Thanksgiving. A lot of people either traveling this weekend, maybe packing up this weekend to get ready to travel next week. But a couple of big storms may make that experience far less pleasant than you would prefer for what's expected to be the biggest holiday travel surge since the pandemic started a year and a half ago. Al Roker is here to talk about that. Al, it's good to see you. And, we talked a couple nights ago about, hey, are these predictions of storms the real deal? And it seems like they are, and they're going to be messy, and they're going to collide right with this holiday travel.
Right. Well, the good news is, Hallie, if there is some good news right now, that West Coast storm is not going to be a real big problem. Nothing like what they have been seeing over the last several weeks. However, we look ahead towards Sunday, and we've got this storm system coming out of Canada, and it brings this low pressure and swings through the Midwest. It brings a line of showers and storms from Texas all the way up into Ohio. We move into Monday, and we're going to have morning rain along the I-95 corridor, but the bigger problem is going to be the winds. These winds are going to come across the record warm waters across the Great Lakes, and the leeward side of the lakes bring some heavy lake effect snow, gusty winds from New England all the way down to Washington, D.C. and Atlanta. Tuesday, that lake effect snow is going to continue. We're going to have bitter wind chills across the Northeast. Snowfall amounts, or rainfall amounts, I should say, stretching from New England all the way down to the Smoky Mountains, about a quarter to a half an inch of rain. However, snowfall amounts from around the Great Lakes, some places, Hallie, could be looking at 12 inches of snow. So that's going to be a problem from Cadillac, Cleveland, Buffalo, on to Syracuse in upstate New York. And
I'm looking at the timing of this, Al. Tuesday and Wednesday, as you well know, my friend, busiest travel days of this holiday week. What airports are you watching? I mean, it looks like it's the ones that are right in that stretch there, right?
Yeah, and a little further to the south, too. So the potential airport delays and impacts. Boston, going to be rain and wind early part of the week, Monday, Tuesday. New York City, Monday, it's going to be gusty winds into Tuesday. Same for Washington, D.C. Cleveland, right on into Tuesday, that snow and wind. Gusty winds for Chicago, as you know, that's a big hub. And Nashville, we're looking at wet weather as well, Hallie. So those are the areas. And on the roads, well, again, if you've got a high-profile vehicle like a van or anything like that, you're going to be running into trouble all along the I-95 corridor from Washington to Bangor. Buffalo to Boston, we're going to have some snow from western New York, then turns into rain and wind as you get into New England. And New York to Cleveland, as you get into Pennsylvania and on into Cleveland, northeastern Ohio, you're going to be dealing with some slushy roads, Hallie.
So by Black Friday, Al, is this cleared out?
Well, we'll look at Thursday, Thanksgiving Day. Really, things are fairly clear. Some showers and heavy storms down through the Gulf, and those are going to linger through Black Friday. Everywhere else, for the most part, is going to be fairly quiet. So you want to get out there and do that shopping, or you're sitting nice and cozy, tucked in, and just
online
shopping
on
your computer.
That's exactly it. Maybe cutting down the Christmas tree. Al Roker, thank you so much for being with us, friend. Appreciate it. Have a great weekend. A big deal day for President Biden today because he's now a step closer to getting his big Build Back Better agenda right over the finish line. Why? Well, the House of Representatives passed that $1.7+ trillion climate and social spending bill this morning, mostly along party lines.
The Build Back Better bill is passed.
It's still got to make it through the Senate. We're watching for that after Thanksgiving. But today, under the umbrella of a day contains multitudes, the president went in for a colonoscopy as well. Routine procedure, part of his physical, but it meant he had to transfer presidential power temporarily over to Vice President Kamala Harris. The Constitution says a president can do this, right, under the 25th Amendment. But this is kind of a big deal because this means that Vice President Harris became the first woman and the first woman of color to become acting president of the United States for 85 minutes. It's only been done a few times in U.S. history that any acting president has stepped in for a president. Most recently, it happened in 2007 with President George W. Bush. Joining me now from the White House is Monica Alba. And Monica, we have to acknowledge what felt at some moments today like a bit of an awkward split screen for President Biden, right? Because he's got this news from the House on his agenda, which he's celebrating. He's got this physical that he's going for a brief time under anesthesia for. And then there's the backdrop of this huge national news that we talked about at the start of the show, which is Kyle Rittenhouse and the verdict coming in on that trial and the president being asked to respond and to react to that in real time, right?
Juggling a ton, Hallie. This day did contain multitudes on any kind of event you could imagine. And it wasn't something that was scheduled in terms of his White House physical. We knew he was going to do it before the end of the year. But late into the night last evening, we were wondering if the president was going to come out and speak after the Build Back Better vote. And of course, that was happening simultaneously while he was under sedation for that colonoscopy. And we did just this very minute get the report from the president's physician giving us all of the information. And in essence and bottom line, he says that the president is completely fit to serve, that he did a whole round of tests. The colonoscopy was routine, according to what I'm looking at here. But two things of note that the president's doctor is telling us about right now. Something he's noticed is a stiffened gait, which the president, if we have all watched him walk across the South Lawn recently, since his foot injury earlier this year, he has had a little bit of trouble walking. And this is now something that his doctor says is a little bit more serious. So they're going to try to treat it, but that it's nothing that should affect his work. And then the other thing we've noticed is his constant throat clearing and coughing. And that is something that they did an endoscopy for to look at to see why he's having these issues with his reflux. And they may be giving him some different ways to try to treat that. But again, nothing that would affect his work as president of the United States. So he's getting a clean bill of health overall from the president, Hallie, which we're just learning about this moment. So that's the latest, but he was juggling a ton from that verdict, urging peace in Kenosha, Wisconsin, celebrating the House advancing his agenda, and then also pardoning some turkeys here today, because that's all a part of the president's day job here.
That is somewhat of whiplash here, Mon. So I got to be honest, I'm reading, as you point out, this is literally just coming in, this information about the president's physical, which, listen, this is typical. This is something that presidents usually do, and there is some transparency around releasing, traditional transparency, I should say, around releasing the results of this. President Biden's turning 79 soon, right, Monica?
Tomorrow is his birthday. And so I think that was a little bit of the calculation here. The White House, in effect, promising again this was going to happen. And if we look back to his predecessors, Hallie, former President Trump, former President Obama, they waited a whole year in office before doing these kinds of physicals at Walter Reed. But because Joe Biden is the oldest sitting commander-in-chief ever in U.S. history, and because there have been some questions about some of his past health experiences, the White House clearly deciding they wanted to get out and do this a little sooner, and that's why I think a little bit ahead of his birthday they did decide this was a good day for it, and then he can go into that, have celebrations tomorrow. The ice cream will be flowing in Wilmington, Delaware, I can tell you that.
Presumably. Won't it also be in the Alba household and the Jackson household as well? Monica Alba, thank you so much. Bottom line there, news out of the White House, President Biden fit for duty, says his doctor. Thanks. Coming up here on the show, an NFL star being accused of something that could actually land him in prison as it relates to his vaccination status. Why? A former employee of Antonio Brown saying the football star's COVID vaccine card is fake. Brown says it's not. The league's looking into it, and so is Sam Brock. We'll have that report next. He's one of the most controversial stars in the NFL, Antonio Brown. If you don't know, he plays for Tampa Bay, and all season so far, he's been working out and practicing and playing under the protocol for vaccinated players who have gotten the COVID shot. And hey, any question about that, just flash your Vax card, right? It's proof. But is it? Because now Brown's ex-chef, Steven Ruiz, is saying Brown forged his proof of vaccination, that it's a total fake, and that Brown showed that off to him, according to the Tampa Bay Times. But also Ruiz has his own thing going here, this big falling out with Brown. He says Brown stiffed him out of 10 grand. So consider that. Bottom line, faking your Vax card is a federal offense. So Brown is now under investigation by the NFL. Sam Brock is following this story. And Sam, listen, tons of people are talking about this one. I know you talk with Antonio Brown's legal team, and they're saying he is fully vaccinated?
His team says he's vaccinated, Hallie, and look, he's an electric talent. Antonio Brown is so talented on the football field that despite the lengthy list of allegations against him, and there's so many, we don't have enough time to discuss them in this 3-minute segment, but he's so good. He's gotten chances 2, 3, and 4. But the reality is that is all immaterial to this investigation, which is, did Antonio Brown fake his vaccination card or not? And this is not some sort of mystery science here. The NFL says that it's investigating. It's not that hard to figure out. A vaccination card leaves a paper trail, right? It's a card. There is a pharmacy or a vaccination site or someplace that has his name on it if he got a shot. Who made the vaccine? How many times did he receive the shot? What was the location? It's all there. All the NFL has to do is go back and verify that and say, yes, he lied, or no, he did not. And that's why there are NFL experts right now saying this is going to be proof of whether or not it's just window dressing when the NFL says it cares about upholding COVID protocol, or it really means it. Well, they have a chance to show that right now.
Because I can't help but think, the lawyers answering and saying he's vaccinated doesn't address the actual allegation that's been made here, right? That his card is a fake. And I want to read from the Buccaneers statement on this report, which says, in part, all vaccination cards were reviewed by Buccaneers personnel and no irregularities were observed. You have to think, Sam, listen, I'm just a human being living in this world, right? But if you're paying $500 for a fake vaccination card, you should hope it's not going to look irregular. You know what I mean? Do the Bucs have any liability here? Like, could they get in trouble potentially? They're the defending Super Bowl champs.
Firstly, for the language, you very correctly point out, it's really important. They say if there were no irregularities observed, what kind of a statement is that? Many people are saying, why didn't you come out and say, we've confirmed that Antonio Brown's vaccination card is real? That is not how they worded that statement. Did not come directly to the Tampa Bay Times. In fact, they didn't say anything to the reporter who broke the story. They just released that statement after the fact. So what does that tell you? But as far as as the NFL is concerned, the teams themselves, Hallie, as the lights come on here, are in fact responsible for verifying for each of their players and staff and personnel whether or not they're vaccinated. Does that mean that the Tampa Bay Bucs could be culpable if it's found out that Antonio Brown had a fake vaccination card? We have no indication to that effect yet. But as you correctly pointed out at the beginning of this newscast, he potentially committed a crime if that's what happened. And there's an agreement between the NFL and its Players Association. There's COVID protocols to be upheld here. There are people who are immunocompromised in the league. Hallie, it's not just the players, but the coaches, the trainers, the staff, people that interact with them. And if he is sick, Antonio Brown got COVID a few weeks ago and lied about his vaccination status, we have a big problem on our hands.
And you're right, Sam. It's illegal, right? This isn't just like an interest. This is the potential for breaking the law here. And listen, you make the point, you probably couldn't tick through the things that Antonio Brown has done that have been problematic for him, to say the least, in 3 minutes. But let's mention a couple of them, right? He got suspended for burglary charges. He's had sexual harassment allegations against him. As you note, he's got chances 2, 3, and 4 in this league. Does any of that, do you think, play into the investigation around him as it relates to the NFL?
It's only relevant, I think, Hallie, in so much as that he's already been suspended for 8 games for personal misconduct that was related to assault of a truck driver that Brown did plead guilty to for burglary charges and for assault. So that's already on the record. He's been suspended. So as a multiple-time offender of personal misconduct violations, potentially, it could lead to a longer suspension. That is possible. But as you correctly point out, again, this is an individual who's been involved in a lot of situations, whether it's with teams, whether it's the law, accusations of assaults from women, from truck drivers. There's a lot out there. And so it's got to be pieced together. But this right now is about faking a vaccination card or not. And the league should come out pretty soon and let us know whether or not that's actually true or just allegations.
I know you're going to stay on top of that one for us. Sam Brock, I appreciate you. Appreciate your time. Thank you. Coming up here on the show, a women's soccer team has been flown safely out of Afghanistan. And one of the people who made it possible, Kim Kardashian. More on that next. Some really interesting news out today on the scientific theories on how the pandemic started in China. Our Keir Simmons has been reporting on this since the pandemic started. He's going to have our backstory a little later on. Plus, we'll talk about the 50-year search for Jimmy Hoffa's body, now centered on a Jersey City landfill. But first, let's get you over to the 5 things our team thinks you should know about tonight. Number 1, A bit of a moment of hope for trying to fix that migrant crisis along the Poland-Belarus border, but it appears that's gone away. Poland is now accusing Belarus of trucking hundreds of migrants back to the border just hours after Belarus said it cleared those camps out. Poland also saying today that Belarus troops are blinding Polish guards with lasers. Number 2, a group of Afghan teenage girl soccer players have Kim Kardashian to thank, in part, for getting them safely into the UK. Kardashian helped pay for the flight that landed in Britain yesterday. Many of these girls and their families had their houses burnt down when the Taliban took over. Number 3, Tiger King's Carole Baskin. There she is, remember her? She is not ready to talk about the disappearance of her second husband, Don Lewis, back in 1997. That's according to a Florida detective investigating the case. He says Baskin has refused requests for interviews 3 times. That case opened back up after Netflix released Tiger King that became a huge hit. You probably watched it at the start of the pandemic. Number 4, overnight, a partial lunar eclipse could be seen. Look at this beautiful shot all across North America and parts of South America. And here's what makes this one special. At 3.5 hours long, it is the longest one to happen in almost 600 years. And Adele dropping what may be the greatest divorce album of the century. How's that? The singer-songwriter releasing her, can we even call it highly anticipated? Highly anticipated album 30 overnight. Obviously, it's climbing the charts. It's her 4th album, and she says this one talks about and addresses in song the 2019 divorce from her husband, Simon Konecki. One European country about to go into what feels like a bit of a deja vu from last year and then some. We're talking about Austria because starting on Monday, they're going to hit another nationwide lockdown for at least 10 days. That means things like schools, doctors, grocery stores will stay open, but all non-essential businesses will be closed. And on top of that, they're about to mandate vaccines for the entire country. You heard that right. By the 1st of February, Austria should be at about 100% vaccination rate. It's now the first country in Europe to mandate vaccines for everyone. They're doing this because they're seeing this COVID surge, and they're trying to figure out the legal framework on that to basically figure out how you could mandate vaccines and say that not getting them could lead to fines or even jail time. Speaking of news from overseas, we want to get to the backstory, our behind-the-scenes look at how a story comes together and how it fits into our bigger picture. And there's a new report out today that gives some insight into the early origins of the pandemic, or at least tries to. So here's the deal. A scientist at the University of Arizona found the WHO, the World Health Organization, probably or may have gotten the early details of how the pandemic actually started wrong. This new report says the very first patient who was infected was a vendor at a seafood market in Wuhan. Experts say this new report is not the be-all, end-all, but the whole thing does revive the debate over how the pandemic started and the disputes behind it. Let me lay out the timeline here, right? Because after China saw its first COVID-like symptoms in December 2019, that seafood market shut down permanently a month later. Then in April of that year, former President Trump claimed to have evidence that COVID started in a Chinese lab. That theory was debunked after the WHO's visit to China. But from the start, there's been this global criticism of China for silencing whistleblowers who came out early, for China's lack of transparency, for the limited access to what China would be willing to share. That debate is still going on now, almost 2 years after it began. And in that interim, more than 5 million people dead from COVID and some real questions unanswered. Our Keir Simmons has been covering this story from the very start. Keir, I want to make sure our viewers here on NBC News Now, who might not always get to watch you on the Today Show or Nightly, know you literally have been covering this from the start. I mean, I know I've seen you in press conferences. You've talked to top officials about the origins of the pandemic.
Right.
It's taken you around the world. Talk to me about how you see this new report based on the work that you've already done on this and what you're hearing about it.
Well, Hallie, you know, it's always surreal and disturbing to cover a story that impacts your life, impacts your family, impacts your neighbors, impacts your country. More so, though, of course, when you are covering a story that's having such an impact on geopolitics, which is what I focus on. So what we've seen in the past years and a few years is people's view of China shifted by the fact that the coronavirus emerged in Wuhan, China, and this continuing fierce debate over exactly where it came from, the origins. Did it leak from a lab? Did it spill over from bats to an animal to humans? This is just the latest report, the latest idea of what might have happened. We don't know. There is not the evidence, Hallie. That is the simple answer.
When you try to listen, what seems to be somewhat clear here is that there might be Chinese officials who hold the answer to this, right? China is certainly, Keir, as you well know, not known for its transparency. You know what I mean? How do you go about that reporting route as you're trying to get in touch, you know, with Chinese officials just to kind of get whatever the state line is there?
Yeah, I mean, listen, if you ask for comment from Chinese officials, you very often do get comment. They are communicating, and actually, in many ways, they're communicating more and more. Of course, what they're saying is a very robust defense of the Chinese government's position. Now, what we do know, of course, is that doctors disappeared, that journalists disappeared in the early days. We don't know whether that was China kind of panicking or whether they were actually deliberately trying to cover something up, and then if they were even trying to cover up where exactly the coronavirus came from. Now, Hallie, there have been some suspicious moments. You mentioned that WHO, that World Health Organization report. In the annex of that report, it talked about conspiracy theories, and among the conspiracy theories was the possibility that the virus might have leaked from a lab. Some of the people involved in that report from outside China with the WHO, who had given the job by the WHO of investigating, later said, actually, we think there is more of a possibility that it escaped. It's not just a conspiracy theory. Again, we don't know. There have been a number of suspicious moves, if you like, by the Chinese. But again, we can't say whether they even know exactly where this virus came from. We may never know, Hallie.
Keir, as you think about the last 18 months, what has surprised you most in the course of reporting this story out over that time period?
Well, I think learning about the nature of biology, about the nature of how a virus like this emerges is actually, I guess, you wouldn't necessarily say that I was surprised, but it's been certainly an evolution. I think that's one thing that I guess people watching and reading don't always remember about us journalists, is that sometimes we're figuring stuff out as we go along, and that's just inevitable. What I think is one of the fascinating aspects of this, I think, is that there are actually a lot of coronaviruses out there, a reservoir of coronaviruses. One of the reasons why some experts say it's more likely that this thing jumped from animals from bats to animals to humans is just because there's so many more coronaviruses out in the natural world than there are in labs. But again, just going to say it one more time, we just don't know, and we may not know, or certainly may not know for many, many years, where this thing came from.
So if you didn't hear Keir the first time or the second time, Keir, I think that third time. I'm hoping people heard you on that. My friend, thank you so much. It's a fascinating look, pulling back that curtain, giving us a sense of what it's like in your shoes. Appreciate it, pal. Taking a turn now to a question that you probably did not think I would be asking you tonight. Where is Jimmy Hoffa? This is a question that people have been asking for 50 years, almost so long that it kind of has become a bit of a punchline, right? Well, today, there's a new headline out, which is that the union boss's body could be buried deep in the dirt somewhere in a New Jersey landfill. The FBI has confirmed to us here at NBC News they searched this site late last month after getting a new lead. Now they're analyzing the data they got. They wouldn't specifically name Hoffa in their statement, but NBC has confirmed it was, in fact, Hoffa's body they were looking for. How'd they get this tip? Apparently from the son of a mafia associate on his deathbed. Hoffa disappeared back in 1975 after having a falling out with a New Jersey mob boss. Maura Barrett is on this story. Maura, again, if you had it on your bingo card that, like, we'd be talking on night 3 of this broadcast about Jimmy Hoffa, like, congratulations, you should buy a Powerball. There's so many theories about what happened to Hoffa. There's been so much bad information and, like, random tips out there. Why did this one actually get the FBI's attention?
Well, this is an absolutely fascinating case, right, Hallie? And there's so many connections around the country to where Jimmy Hoffa could be. And so this tip, like you just mentioned, the son of a former mafia associate had actually worked at the landfill where he said he buried Hoffa's body in a steel drum 15 feet underground. And so that's obviously very peculiar. Some specific details were left behind. And there's actually an investigative journalist, Dan Moldea, who used to work for NBC actually on this investigation. But he's been covering this case for more than 50 years before Hoffa even disappeared in the first place. And he really urged the FBI, saying that his sources said that this site was going to be 100% legitimate. And so there's a lot of behind the scenes here, but the FBI digging up some evidence, some soil samples that they're now analyzing at this landfill. And they say that they're going to have to finish that analysis before they proceed any further.
But the FBI has already searched this site, haven't they?
Right, exactly. They did search it back in 1975, which was when Hoffa originally went missing. They had a search warrant for another missing persons case at this landfill, but they were looking for Hoffa at the time, but they didn't have the specifics of where the body could be, if at all, right? And this is a big site, and so they dug around a little bit, but didn't find anything. And this is something that the FBI, there's been many searches across the country. The focus mainly in Michigan, because that is where Hoffa had gone missing after he was supposed to meet with a few mob bosses. And so there's a lot of theories about whether he could have been killed in Michigan and then buried in New Jersey, or buried somewhere else and then his body moved elsewhere. And so there's obviously a lot of theories, but this is the latest in a series of searches across the country over the last 50 years that the FBI is feeling pretty hopeful on.
Maura Barrett, thank you very much for bringing us that. Appreciate it. Coming up here on the show, the new investigation into opioid overdoses for people who say they were only smoking weed. We've got that coming up in the local. And it wasn't supposed to work out this way for a retired teacher who was really smart with her pension. Prices are going up, but the money coming in staying the same. That's tonight's original. One word might be responsible for maybe disrupting the lives of a whole lot of people who plan their retirement really carefully. That word is inflation. And it's hurting some people pretty intensely right now. We're going to talk about the real-world impact of it in the original coming up. But first, NBC News covers hundreds of stories every day. And because you couldn't possibly read or watch or listen to them all, our bureau teams have done it for you. This is what they tell us is going down in their regions in a segment we call The Local. From our West Coast Bureau, the defense for Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes is asking the judge in her fraud trial for an acquittal after the prosecution rested its case earlier. Holmes' lawyers say the government hasn't provided enough evidence to find her guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. We don't know if Holmes is going to take the stand when the trial picks back up. Obviously, if she does, you'll hear about it here. Our Northeast Bureau reporting Connecticut's Department of Public Health is investigating reports of laced weed leading to serious overdoses. The patients are saying they only smoked weed, but that their symptoms match what would have happened if they overdosed on opioids. At least one of the cases had the cannabis involved test positive for fentanyl, and one person died. And out of our D.C. Bureau, the White House had some very special guests today. 2 turkeys, peanut butter, and jelly. They got the presidential pardon just in time for Thanksgiving. They're headed for a farm in Indiana where they can breathe a Thanksgiving sigh of relief. Good thing those birds are not headed to my house. We want to bring you now today's original, a story you may not have seen anywhere else, and one that really hits home for a lot of people during a time of record inflation. Tonight, you're going to meet a retired school teacher who's living on the same budget, even as the cost of living goes up. A real-world look at how inflation is affecting people right now.
I can see you.
Jan Stewart loved teaching elementary school. She did it for 31 years in Ohio, paying into a pension that whole time for when she retired.
We didn't get raises during some of the higher inflationary times in the 80s and 90s, but we were always told, but you're going to have a really great retirement.
How much is your pension monthly?
I net around $3,800 a month.
And that has not gone up in almost 5 years now?
The last raise I got was in 2016.
Stewart's budget hasn't really changed over the years, but what she can afford has changed. Why? Inflation. The cost of living creeps up steadily every year. It always does, a little bit, with food, bills, and transportation usually getting anywhere from 1% to 3% more expensive. But this year, so far, the inflation rate has jumped above 6%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. If it stays that way longer term, like another 5 years, a person living on $40,000 a year would need to make $51,000 just to keep up. For Stewart, this is not theoretical math.
I keep a budget of everything that I spend all the time, so I always know, well, this is how much I have left, this is how much I have left, you know, and it's just how it's worked for me. And like I said, I had it all planned out, and through no fault of my own, I'm in this position today that is unfair.
And with her budget margin so razor thin, it means any unexpected extra expense, like the upcoming tax assessment on her house, could mean major moves.
It's very likely that I will then have to make the decision to move out of this neighborhood that I've lived in for 34 years.
Stewart's not alone. Millions of retirees live on fixed incomes, many relying on pensions too. But pension experts say not all of those funds have enough money to pay out cost of living raises every year.
Most public pension plans are underfunded. Public pension funding levels and costs are influenced by multiple factors. Investment performance is a significant factor.
Experts point out the market's doing well right now, the unemployment rate's down, and bank accounts bigger on average than they were a couple years ago. But nearly 70% of people overall feel like the economy's getting worse, with inflation looming large. NBC News senior business correspondent Stephanie Rule explains the factors at play here.
The way businesses keep supplies and prices somewhat steady is about planning and consistency, and nothing has been consistent throughout the pandemic. The way we live, the way we work, the way we shop has changed dramatically. So until these adjustments can be made from businesses about how they plan their business going forward, we can expect shortages and these high prices, at least for the short term.
Social Security recently announced a nearly 6% hike in benefits checks because of those higher consumer prices. But federal law lets states exclude employees from Social Security coverage if they get a pension, people like Jan. Because of that, most public workers in 7 states, including Ohio, can't collect Social Security if they also get a pension.
I live in a non-Social Security state, so first of all, I'll say I'm not going to ever collect any Social Security from my former spouse, so that's not part of my scenario. So I rely solely on my pension.
For Stewart, it's not the psychological impact of inflation, it's her actual purchasing power. And these days, keeping up with costs seems harder and harder to do.
Do you think you would be in a different situation right now financially if you had been getting those cost of living adjustments?
Oh, there's no doubt about it. Oh, I would be in I would not be having any financial concerns today.
None.
None.
The Ohio Pension Board said it would like to give retirees an increase, but only if a financial review shows it can afford one. All right, you have a drink with dinner, you get in your car to drive home, and you think you're okay, but soon your car may overrule you. Yeah, Carrie Sanders is behind the wheel to show us the new tech aimed at preventing drunk driving. So the companies that make cars have a huge homework assignment to figure out with a due date sometime in the next 5 years. They've got to figure out a high-tech way to keep drunk people from driving. Congress basically mandated that when they passed the infrastructure law, which does include money to help the industry try to figure that out. Each year, about 10,000 people are killed because of alcohol-related crashes, making up nearly 30% of all traffic deaths. So what would this technology actually look like in your car? Our Carrie Sanders has been working on this story for a while. He's joining us now live tonight. Carrie, good evening. It's great to see you. Obviously, you're inside of a car for this one. You sort of have to be. What's the deal with this anti-drunk driving technology?
Well, you know, if you've been in a very modern car, one that was maybe just produced in the last year or so, there's some amazing technology that's in cars. If you take your eyes off where you're driving for just a few seconds, the car will alert you. If you begin to swerve, the car will recognize there's problems. So Mothers Against Drunk Driving says that they have identified 241 pieces of technology that's in the most modern cars today that could be applied to prevent a drunk driver from getting behind the wheel.
So this tech already exists, right? The tech is there, and it's a function for car makers now to figure out how do you apply that to these situations where there could be somebody who's, you know, had too much to drink and get behind the wheel of a car.
So does it exist? Well, it depends who you talk to. The Automotive Innovators Association says that there is potential for this technology. However, in Europe, there are some car manufacturers like Volvo that have already put that type of technology in cars that they say effectively has brought people who are drunk over to the side of the road and caused the car from stopping.
Wow.
Just telling the driver they can't drive anymore because it's been determined that they're drunk.
We're talking about like tech, Carrie, but the real core of this is people. You know, it's people whose lives have been affected by drunk drivers. And I know you had a chance to talk with the family of a mother of 6 young kids who was killed, right, by a drunk driver. This is technology that makes a difference to the lives, that could make a difference to the lives of so many people, Carrie.
Yeah, I mean, okay, so young Katie's driving home from the hospital. She had just given birth to her twins, so her final 2 children, and they were kind of early births, so she had just checked on them. She's heading home, and that's when she was hit and killed by a drunk driver. This is what her father had to tell us.
What was your reaction then, and what is it today?
Just deep sorrow and grief. Deep sorrow and grief. And it's still there. We're 3.5 years after the accident, and it still hurts. It still hurts. I get a little angry about car makers not making safety features available when they have the ability to do it. That frustrates me and to a certain extent angers me. It makes me mad.
And so therein lies what Ken Hallie says needs to be done, and the infrastructure bill should force this to happen.
Yeah. So timeline-wise, obviously that family, right, so many families would want this in yesterday, this technology to be done yesterday. How much longer before I can go out and get a new car that has this tech in it? What are you hearing? What do you think?
Well, with the infrastructure bill, it took about 3 years, then getting the technology kind of perfected because there's 3 years to work on it, 2 years to then get it by manufacturers into cars. So we're talking about at least 5 years, and probably because not everybody buys a new car every year, we're talking at least probably 2 decades before this becomes sort of widespread, but rather significant if a smart car can do what so many have tried to do. I mean, there's a drunk driving accident in our country once every 48 minutes.
It's just a disturbing and difficult to hear statistic. Kerry Sanders, thank you so much for this reporting on something that's so interesting and so critical for people to know about. I appreciate you being with us. I appreciate all of you being with us as we wrap up our launch week right here on Hallie Jackson Now. That's a wrap for us this hour. We'll see you here same time, same place Monday. More coverage picks up right now.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.